So hello everyone, welcome to the workshop. We are incredibly delighted to see so many faces and names in the list. At the moment we already have over 40 people joining us, and we received over 150 registrations. So it looks like this is going to be a quite active workshop, more than we expected at the beginning. And it will be a pleasure to get to know as many of you in the next couple of days. I would like to start by saying a few words on behalf of the four co-organizers, and I will try to be as comprehensive as possible without extending myself too much. So I'll start by thanking the other co-organizers, Isabel Jacobs, Carl Moore, and Trevor Wilson, who were tireless in the organization of the workshop. We have organized it because we realized that a broader reception of Kojève was long overdue, and that the conditions were finally gathered for such an event. First, an increasing amount of previously unpublished texts are now available in published form, as well as some of them at the French National Library, allowing for readings that go beyond the repeated Hegelian interpretation. We try to represent as much of the scholarship as was possible, while simultaneously trying to keep the workshop in a contained time frame. Sadly, this means that we had to reject several submissions, but we are confident that thanks to the amazing contributions we were able to gather, this workshop will show the increasing relevance of the research on Kojève. Secondly, the existence of a large community of scholars working on Kojève, focusing on almost every facet of the very diverse contributions legated to us by Kojève, and working from very different intellectual and disciplinary perspectives. An example of this diversity can be found in the work of my co-organizers, who rescinded their chance of presenting their own work in order to give room for as many people to present their work as possible. Trevor Wilson works largely on the interchanges within 20th century Russian emigre thought, and in what interests us today, particularly on Kojève's contribution to it. Isabel Jacobs' works explores the aesthetic dimensions of Kojève's work and how it is linked to a broad range of intellectual and philosophical contemporary movements. Carl Moore approaches the guiding lines of Kojève's overall philosophical project and on how Kojève's innovations are placed within the philosophical tradition. My own research deals with the political dimension of Kojève's thought, and currently I focus on Kojève's early groundwork for his later political writings. Obviously, these two conditions only arise because Kojève's contributions offer critical insights that are useful for the questions that concern us nowadays. At this point in time, human action and existence remain as central as they ever were at any point in human history. Therefore, we cannot overlook Kojève's contribution to topics such as climate and epidemiological analysis and their political implications. Kojève's proposals on the connection between human existence and nature, or between human existence and science, should contribute to any informed debate on these topics. Kojève was equally industrious in the development of international frameworks that could attenuate the economic implications of the measures that result from the previous example. While our aim in this workshop is to understand Kojève's thought, his interpretations are only meaningful for us if we update them or translate them into our time. This applies equally to our special location in this workshop. This dislocated space in which we meet is likely one of the most characteristic signatures of our time, at least in the parts of the world in which most of us live. So Kojève's insistence on the role of our here and now to understand our existence is as explicit for all of us as it was for Kojève. Now I would like to say a few words to thank people who made this workshop possible. First of all, to all the speakers, and we would like to mention particularly the two keynote speakers, Boris Groys and Massimo Palma, whose presentations will add particularly interesting contributions for the fruitful discussion we expect during these 3 days. Virginia Tech and Queen Mary University of London for hosting the event, Calendar Films, who kindly provided us permission to show their new Kojève documentary while it is still in post-production, and everyone involved in its production. More will be said about this tomorrow. To finish with a few technical notes. Tomorrow, we will have a roundtable on the new documentary on Kojève. Please make sure to watch it beforehand. The link and password to watch it were sent to you in the registration confirmation email. You probably already noticed that several of you have your cameras and microphones off. We'll be turning them on to the panelists, and they will also be turned on whenever you want to speak. Please raise your hand on Zoom, and we'll turn the cameras and the mics on for the discussion. In the meanwhile, feel free to post a question in the chat or Q&A at any point. As part of the relevance of these events is for us to get to know each other, please join in to our Friday post-conference Zoom drink, in which we'll have a chance to all talk for a little while. Also, even though we are all used to these online events, please try to comprehend a few flaws that might appear during the event. And we also like to let you know that we are recording the Zoom meeting. So be aware of that. Now I will give the word to Galin Tihanov, who is the George Steiner Professor of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London, who kindly accepted to open the workshop.
Thank you very much indeed. And I speak today primarily in my capacity as director of the Comparative Literature PhD program, and it is on behalf of the doctoral program in Comparative Literature in the School of Languages, Linguistics and Film at Queen Mary University of London that I'm really, really delighted to welcome you all today to this no doubt landmark workshop on Alexandre Kojève. Kojève has emerged over the last 50 years as a thinker of stunning breadth and momentous impact. From reconceptualizing power, submission, and desire to responding to innovation in art and getting involved in photography, from reflecting on religion and atheism, on the state and its authority in the early stages of globalization, to shaping economic integration in what was an early blueprint for a European Union, Kojève has always been stupendously suggestive, often also consequential in the longer run. He straddles at least three intellectual contexts: Russian, French, German, often crossing their boundaries in a seminal way and moving beyond their contours. It is particularly pleasing that this conference has been initiated and organized by graduate students. And I wish to thank warmly Isabel Jacobs of Queen Mary University of London, whose foresight and energy have been propelling the idea of bringing you all together on this occasion to discuss Kojève's multifaceted work. Just as much, we extend sincere thanks to Kylie Moore and Jorge Varela of Kingston University, London, and to Trevor Wilson from Virginia Tech University. Thanks also to Virginia Tech University for sponsoring the conference, including the screening rights for the film. We trust this will be a most enjoyable and intellectually rewarding few days. And without further ado, I will now hand over to the organizers in anticipation of great papers and a good discussion. Thank you again and welcome.
Thank you, Galin. I suppose we are going to wait a few more minutes until we start the first panel, so people can join in because we are still 3 minutes away from the scheduled time, and As Carl Moore already mentioned, Sabina Tortorella will not be participating. Therefore, we are comfortable for that first panel. So to make sure that although we already have 50 participants online, if some other people might join in the next 3 minutes, it will be nice for the presenters. So does everyone agree with that we should wait? Yeah.
Yeah, we can wait 2 minutes, George, and people can grab one last chance for a coffee before we dive into the meat and potatoes.
I also noticed that both our speakers are already online, Luis and Teresa Pullano, Luis Pedrazuela and Teresa Pullano are already online. So yeah. I also didn't mention it at the beginning, but it's nice to have people from all over the world. And I'm looking now at the list of attendees. And it's easy to see that at least that we have people from at least both sides of the Atlantic, and we had interest from all over the world. So hopefully it will be a very interesting workshop that will allow us to understand a little bit more what's being done currently on Kojève. So perhaps I will start I'll open the first panel, which is titled Law, Economics and Administration. The first talk will be by Teresa Pullano, So Teresa Pullano is a political philosopher. She has been assistant professor at the law faculty and the Institute of European Global Studies of the University of Basel between 2014 and 2020. Among other publications, she's the author of La citoyenneté européenne en espace quasi-étatique, which was published in 2014 by Presse de Sciences Po. The title of her talk today is Kojève in Europe as the Empire of Law. So I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and thank you very much to Isabel, Trevor, Jorge, and Kyle for organizing this conference. I'm really happy about it because sometimes, I mean, I already met some of the people in the conference, but sometimes as a Kojève scholar, one feels quite lonely. So it's very nice to have this event. So my talk is based on a paper I published on the journal Philosophie in 2017, and the title of the paper is Kojève and Europe as the Empire of Law. So my paper starts from acknowledging how large parts of Kojève's philosophical work are still little known and studied. I refer in particular to his political and legal philosophy. Especially in my paper, I deal with his outline of a phenomenology of right. This text was published posthumous in 1981. The gap in contemporary legal and political theory concerning Kojève's work is even more striking if we consider that he devoted large part of his career as a French civil servant to build international agreements concerning trade law, but also concerning the structure of the European community. From a theoretical perspective, my presentation focuses on Kojève's conceptualization of the universal and homogeneous state, and of the subject that corresponds to it, the citizen. The universal and homogeneous state is defined by Kojève as a cosmopolitan state, since it implies the whole of humanity. It is also a state in which there are no variations, that is, no wars, no revolutions. It will therefore be a post-revolutionary state. I understand Kojève's post-revolutionary thought as the necessity of thinking history as immanent to mankind, without positing any transcendental horizon, either theological or teleological. The theme of the end of history, as I understand it, means that there is nothing outside the contingent dimension of human temporality, neither a divine foundation, nor a collective power of foundation or of refoundation of the political community. Therefore, it is not possible to think about the possibility of a new temporality or a new era of human history. The historical question is for Kojève coeval with the anthropological question. So we have here the dyadic theme of the relationship between the time and the subject. The theme of the end of history has to be read as the question of how to think history without positing a singular collective as the subject of such an evolution. This is, for me, this is how I read Kojève's outline. And this is for me really a very original and significant point Kojève makes. So if I translate this philosophical question of how to think history without positing a singular collective as the subject of history, we could say, for example, how is it possible to think a history without a people? Or, to make it even more concrete, without that specific people that is the national community. Kojève writes the outline in 1943, even though it is published posthumously in 1981. And thus, his political question is the one of how to rethink the European order after World War II. At the same time, so what is very interesting for me is that in the outline we have the political question, and Kojève here and now, he interrogates the conjuncture, to say it with Balibar, in which he writes. But at the same time, the questioning of the historical conjuncture always goes together with the philosophical question. And this is also for me very striking. So the outline stems from a philosophical question. The aim of man is for Kojève absolute knowledge or wisdom. And wisdom implies a perfect correspondence between knowledge, that is concept, and human life, that is time. Law, which is the subject of the outline, is for Kojève one of the ways that allows to create the conditions for the system of absolute knowledge, and thus for the correspondence of concept and time. Therefore, breaking Kojève duality, I would here say that conceptually in the outline, we interrogate the relationship between concept, time, and the subject. The historical question of the international order of Europe and of the world is also at the center of Kojève's conference, Colonialism from a European Perspective. This talk was given by Kojève in Düsseldorf in 1957 at the invitation of Carl Schmitt. I deal also with the text of the conference in my paper. I cross Kojève's understanding of the nation as it appears in the text of the conference of 1957 with his interpretation of the relation between the nation and law as it stands in the outline. The theme of law is central in Kojève's understanding of the development of the nation into a borderless state, bringing together the citizens of the whole world. The realization of a system of universal law is the tool to accomplish the end of history, or the evolution of man into the figure of the citizen. There is a link, of course, between the outline of the phenomenology of law and Kojève's interpretation of Hegel. Law is treated by Kojève in its relation to time. Law is essential for any aspect of human existence, especially if we consider it in its political dimension. Precisely given the fact that law is tied to human activity, it is constituted by and through time. And also, I find very interesting this approach of Kojève of law through time, which I could, for example, associate to a very different scholar like Jan Thomas in his understanding of law, exactly as an anthropological experience. In the outline, not only the category of time, but also the one of space plays a central role. For law to be actualized, it needs to extend without territorial limits. This is why the nation is a political form that does not fit the post-revolutionary epoch. In other words, it is the move from the national to the global scale that allows law, which incarnates the figure of the third, to set into motion the end of history. The end of history coincides with the coming into being of the citizen as the post-revolutionary subject. The partition of the earth into political and legal units distinct one from the other is one of the themes of the debate between Kojève and Carl Schmitt. In the Düsseldorf conference, which happened at the invitation of Carl Schmitt himself, Kojève presents his vision of Europe as a unified space and society. What Kojève does in the conference is what I would call a defense of a European Großraum. In the text of the conference, Kojève at the same time provincializes Europe. Kojève announces that he will discuss the issue of colonialism only from an economic perspective and not from a political one. He puts colonialism in relation with capitalism and socialism. Europe as the West, says Kojève in 1957, does not exist anymore. The Western world, he writes, is rather African and Asian. Capitalism, as defined by Marx, exists rather in the Soviet Union than in Europe. Europe could therefore rethink its own political and legal order only by renouncing to its centrality and putting in place what Kojève calls a colonialism of gift. For Kojève, the world is already unified economically, and he is already seeing that in 1957. So Marx was right in his definition of capitalism. It is precisely such a unity that allows the existence of a global proletariat. The contradiction between capitalism and the proletariat is now global rather than national. It is therefore the global scale, says Kojève, also partitioned and traversed by lines of fracture that gains primacy. Economic colonialism is for Kojève the main political problem of the time. So the problem for Kojève is the one of the form of the institutions that will manage conflicts in the post-revolutionary era. And the second question he deals with is the one of the spatial scale of the strategy needed to minimize these conflicts. And I will stress this again. Kojève is one of the few political and legal philosophers who has the clarity of seeing that the problem after the Second World War is the one of thinking the new form of the institution. And again, I think that this could be also a contribution. I mean, Kojève's contribution could really step into contemporary debates on the theme of the institution. So law plays a central role in this institutional and spatial strategy at the post-revolutionary time. The end of World War II completes the historical transformation, including a change in the scale of the political action and discourse. It is law in its relation to time that now takes the role of being the integrative force that was before played by the revolutionary movements. The universal and homogeneous state is a necessary condition for the realization of law and its actualization. The constitution of humanity as a unified subject is, as Kojève writes in the outline, needed for the accomplishment of the post-revolutionary time. This passage takes place in two steps. At first, through the expulsion of all heterogeneous elements from the system, which is at the same time the juridical and political one and the system of absolute knowledge. The second step is the move from the point of view of the actor to the one of the spectator. To understand what Kojève means here, we need to go back to the introduction to the reading of Hegel. History is the desire of desire. It is the negation of the unmediated relation to nature, and it has a beginning, the master-slave dialectic, and an end, absolute knowledge. The difference between anthropological and animal desire is here essential. The action that produces history is a fight for that which does not exist in nature. It is a fight for desire and for the recognition of this desire as human. To get this recognition, man can put at risk his own natural needs. Concept and reality do not coincide at the beginning, but only at the end of history, at the end of the fight among desires of desires. This will give birth to the citizen, a recognized members of the universal and homogeneous state. In the outline and in line with the introduction, nature, the animal element, the heterogeneous element not reconductible to the equation between time and concept, has to be negated by human action. It is this action that is the foundation of historical temporality and of the subject. Natural difference is thus the blind spot of the state, to say it with Georges Bataille. Indeed, in the outline, Kojève writes that the universal state has no outside. There is no law outside the universal society of the end of history. To the teleological movement of historical temporality corresponds the movement of expansion of a space with no outside, that is a unified space that realizes the identity between the temporal becoming and the concept of law. This coincides with the introduction of the impartial spectator during the anthropogenic scene of the fight to death between the master and the slave. It is this figure of the impartial spectator that is at the origin of the law and that shifts the fight for recognition towards the end of history. The homogeneity of the state, the circularity of time and concept is not given from the start, but it is rather the outcome of a process. Kojève's system is based upon the inclusion of the blind spot within the universal state and the absolute knowledge and its neutralization. The heterogeneous element is therefore not excluded, on the opposite. In other words, Kojève's question is how to get to the global state, starting from the heterogeneity of national histories, not negating them, but including them in the new European and global order. For Kojève, the only possibility to get a universal citizenship is to get out of modernity. This outcome being at the same time the perfect accomplishment of this same modernity. We can measure here the whole difference of Kojève's understanding of a cosmopolitan state with the Kantian one. There is a universal citizenship only when it is extended to the whole of humanity. In the second part of the outline entitled The Origin and Evolution of Droit, Kojève exposes how we move from the fight for the desire of desire to a universal and homogeneous society. The need to be recognized by equals and to be able to recognize them brings the spectator of the fight to be impartial. This is the key to Kojève's political system. His political thought could be defined, I think, as hyper-modern. Indeed, he pushes to the extreme consequences the essence of Hegel's philosophy of history. This is the acknowledgement that the truth of history is in the sight of the third, the external spectator. For Kojève, it is precisely the third that allows the establishment of justice and who is the source of law, droit. The third judges in an impartial manner the fairness of the fight between the master and the slave. He foresees that the conditions of the fight are the same wherever and at any time, and he does so for the need of fairness, that is the need to recognize and being recognized. It is the figure of the third that makes the end of history possible through the end of conflict. He is already outside of history since he already denied the animal part, which is the engine of history. Schmidt refers explicitly in his correspondence with Kojève to the link between the figure of the enemy and the animal functions in Hegel. Kojève replies that animal functions can constitute the enemy only insofar as there is a revolutionary history and insofar as the post-revolutionary state of absolute knowledge is not reached. The animal as enemy and especially the enemy as animal, falls within the circularity of history and concept, because it is what cannot be said and does not understood. With the animal, the space is absorbed within the post-revolutionary system. The stability of the polis equates for Kojève to its complete humanization. The figure of the third is the one of the master, who comes out as the winner of the fight to death, and who makes sure that the other fights are conducted in an equitable manner. The legal unification of the word must be followed by a political one. Law is real only within a universal and homogeneous state. The universal and homogeneous state is the realization of justice through law, and it implies the elimination of the political in the Schmittian sense. In the universal state, there will be only friends and no enemy. The end of history is thus the end of politics in the Schmittian sense. In the universal state, there will be no government. That is, no distinction between those who rule and those who are ruled. There is no justification for the ruling of some people over others. Here we find a resonance with Arendt. For her as well, the political ideal is isonomie, that is, neither to rule, not to be ruled. For Kojève, though, the absence of government translates into the neutralization of politics as a source of difference and of conflict. Regulation and administration will take the place of politics. And citizenship at the end of history is very much is resembling empires' citizenship. I would just like to end with a note. I think that what I like very much in Kojève's understanding of the state and law are two things. On the one hand, being myself also a scholar of Europe and European law, I really think that Kojève's understanding of the homogeneous and universal state can serve as a blueprint for understand Europe today. So Kojève here and now. But even more, I think that where Kojève is really useful is in providing a model for thinking statehood beyond the Schmittian model, but at the same time beyond also the Kantian model. And I think that much work should be done in the future in this line. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. That was a great talk, and we'll have a discussion for both talks at the end. And thank you for staying with the time, because I was about to write the message saying you have 2 more minutes when you said this will be my final word. So thank you for that, for making my work easy as well. So now I will pass to Luis Pedrazuela's presentation. Luis Pedrazuela holds a PhD in philosophy from Spain's Carlos III University in Madrid, with a thesis on Kojève titled Death in Brussels and Circularity of Knowledge. He currently researches on political theory and geopolitics. And his talk is titled Alexandre Kojève's Economic Undertakings, an Overview. So to you, Luis.
Right. Thank you very much, Jorge. I would like to first make a remark. I've changed somewhat I have changed somewhat the title on the topic of my talk, and the title reads now An Approach to Alexandre Kojève's Economic Thinking. And this is the result of my attempt to come to grips with Alexandre Kojève's thought in general, but specifically in its economic aspect. So my presentation aims to give an account of the economic implications of certain Kojèvian notions. The conclusion of my presentation suggests a possible continuity between these implications and Kojève's joining the French Ministry of Economy at the end of 1945. For Kojève, the concept, say, of table, does not stem from a Platonic idea of which said concept is a worldly representation. Far from it, the concept originates in the desire of man to negate a natural need. Accordingly, the concept table would owe its origin to man's negation of the natural need that makes him bend down each time he has to pick up something from the floor. It is the desire to negate the effort to which one is constrained by nature, what in the first place gives rise ideally to the Platonic table. Thereupon, man draws up the rational project of producing the concrete table according to the ideal table. Said another way, springing from a desire which as such has no real existence, the negativity of human work relies on an understanding that separates and freely reshuffles what is given in the natural world. Still, Kojève's account of man's essentially anti-natural desire does not stop here. He holds additionally that the being of man is made up of two complementary aspects. These aspects presuppose the negation of nature, since the being of man is not his biologic reality, but his duty to be man, as he calls it. The duty to be man entails either running a risk to the death or engaging oneself in a work that replaces the natural reality by a technical or cultural one. These two duties cannot be referred to an abstract theologic Kantian duty, and if the idea of duty is in general connected with that of negation, there is a positive side to it which Kojève relates to a specific duty, namely to man's duty to be recognized, which results from man's becoming aware of his desire to be recognized. If the duty to be recognized implies the mere negation of the given, the corresponding desire relates to the positive value of being desired or value of recognition. Whereas the first duty would correspond, for instance, to vanity, vain vanity being a frequent expression in Kojève, the latter would correspond to the positive value of honor, honor being what transforms vanity into a positive reality, equivalent as such to any natural positivity. Honor and the corresponding value of being desired are the cornerstone of a positive set of values that raise man's desire to be recognized by the others, by society as a whole, and ultimately by everyone to the hallmark of humanity. Yet man's hypocrisy makes him reluctant to admit that he acts moved by such values, and he hides from himself the social origin of his duties. In the specific case of his duty to work, man seldom admits that he works to be recognized by the others. Instead, he tells himself that he works for money or to become wealthier, but neither money nor wealth give a sound account of the specific joy that man derives from living better, or at least not worse, than his neighbor. Insofar as it is liable to be taken as a sample of those others whose recognition man seeks, the portrait of the envious neighbor that TV commercials often display may actually lie at the heart of Kojève's notion of desire, assuming as he does that, I quote, the desire that focuses on a natural object is not human unless it is mediated by another desire that focuses on the same object. Human is to desire that which the others desire because they desire it. Spurred by the projection of his desire for recognition on the same thing as his neighbor, the slave or bourgeois proceeds to negate it and to assimilate the thing through his work. He renders thus the word livable by turning the thing he desires into a technical or cultural one, while he imposes himself, I quote, on the other as the supreme value. Liberated from the biologically given, the concept words that the slave or bourgeois articulates are free to refer to any time and to any place, making possible mental associations hitherto unimaginable. The man-made thing is in fact nothing but a concept that the slave or bourgeois actualizes through his understanding and work. The conceptual separation that the slave or bourgeois performs is double. On the one hand, he separates himself from his natural environment. On the other, he separates from the biologic reality of his own body, since the concept thing he produces is not meant to be consumed by him, nor incorporated to his body. Still, the man-made thing or artificial object taken as a finished product possesses an empirical aspect that keeps on linking it to nature. Being this so, it is no less true that the production of the artificial object relies on a concept project, which devised with a view to producing the item in question, remains in the slave or bourgeois mind. If there is an eventual change of circumstances and the slave or bourgeois starts enjoying an autonomy which he has thus far been deprived of, the product's essential independence, both from nature and from the slave's or bourgeois body, is not altered. What changes is the ownership of the finished product, which now belongs to the slave or bourgeois, who views the product not as something he has to attach to the body of the master, but as the object of a voluntary exchange, as something, therefore, that is essentially detachable or exchangeable. Prior to becoming an artificial object, the product is a raw material to which the slave or bourgeois applies his work according to the concept project that he has in mind or that he has been ordered to have. Work as a phenomenon relates to and depends on nature when it comes to its execution. This dependence is for Kojève the source of specialization. Specialization gathers the aspects of work which make it a function of the particular being of the thing. The output or performance of the product, by contrast, that is the fact that once produced, the product allows to perform things that were previously unfeasible, relates to the universal aspect of work, that is to say, to the aspect through which the slave or bourgeois transcends nature and gains independence of it. Humanly considered, needs do not relate to the natural or particular aspects of a specialization, but rather to the universal aspect of work, which is capable of generating as many needs or more than nature and specialization themselves. Escaping any natural fixation, universal needs can change indefinitely, whereas the artificial object taken as a finished product is as unable as nature is to halt the variations of needs that work's universal aspect unleashes. This last aspect is capable of generating a universal need even in those who do not participate in the production process. It is enough that they regard the product as an object of exchange or commerce. Kojève says in this respect, I quote, that the conceptual logic character of the product realizes and reveals itself objectively in and through exchange. A similar thing happens to the master, namely that he winds up desiring to consume rather than exchange, in his case, the product that his slave produces, even if he did not desire it at the outset. The bottom line is here that human work and universal needs feedback one another, resulting in a circuit of ever new needs, and that the only means a specialized worker has, as someone who is also subject to those universal needs, to satisfy them is to exchange the product that he produces against another one that a specialized worker like him offers in the market. The value of a product designates, therefore, the product taken as an object of exchange or commerce, or otherwise put, as a concept. Taken as such, the product transcends its natural and its material here and now as a natural thing and a finished product, respectively. The product's conceptual essence is the effective result of a project being, in turn, I quote, a concept conceived prior to its real existence. Function of both the product's likelihood of being exchanged against another one and of the quality of the work it incorporates, its price is fixed where the exchange takes place, namely in the market. For Kojève, human work is first and foremost a social interaction. He defines work against the backdrop of some definitions of work that overlook its constitutive social aspect. Neither the sheer interaction between the worker and the thing, nor the work of a slave, for instance, constitute in his eyes a social interaction. Neither does the cooperation among workers taken as mere producers, that is, as necessary co-workers grouped in a team in order to produce something. Such a cooperative work is to be found among animals, and most significantly, it is determined by the given thing or the finished product. A qualitative change ensues, however, if work is regarded from the point of view of the thing to be produced. From this perspective, cooperative interactions in the workplace are no longer determined by the raw materials in the natural world, nor by the finished product that lay in it, but by the anticipation of the work's outcome contained in the concept project. The collective realization of a concept project implies that each of the co-workers receives the part that another produces in a kind of virtual exchange that takes place while the product is being produced. This virtual exchange, internal to the productive process, is what Kojève calls salary. Salary, accordingly, would be the pay that each participant in the collective work receives. Its amount is equivalent to the part of work of another worker, as if, I quote, each participant would cast a salary that he would thereupon fully spend in acquiring a share of the product of the work. With the aim to emphasize both the social aspect of human work as exchange, or else exchange as human work, and its complement, the economic civil society that grounds on it, Kojève says, I quote again, that kinship is represented in the economic society by exchange. Exchange contracts bind the members of the economic society together very much as kinship, and kinship contracts binds together the members of the family society. Thus far, I have talked about the working slave or bourgeois. The reason for this is that the exchange contract is something that falls exclusively within the slave or bourgeois mindset. In the warmongering mind of the aristocratic master, there is no place for such issues. However, it is no less true that his notion of property, that the master's notion of property, stems not so much from the universal or total risk he runs for the sake of his human honor, as from the partial risk he takes for a given thing. Now, since the given thing is determined by its particular here and now, it follows that property in the aristocratic world is a particularizing factor that dehumanizes the master and strips him of his universal and human qualities. Very much the opposite happens in the case of the slave or bourgeois, property right being in his case a function of a notion of work that is equal to exchange, and thus to a concept project that binds the bourgeois workers as tightly as kinship does within the family. Hence, in the bourgeois economic society, the particularizing aspect of work does not contribute to the slave's loss of humanity, but rather to the contrary. A virtual exchange internal to the productive process makes its members perform the work according to a concept project that triggers an ever-changing set of universal needs. On the other hand, having recognized the universal value of the master's victory as the just outcome of the fight, the members of the economic society seek the universality latent in their notion of work to enter the universal realm that the master's victory has opened. In short, while the aristocratic particularity embodied in a notion of property that is linked to both the fight and the absence of social interactions is as unlikely to become universal as it openly contributes to dehumanize the master, the particularity of the slave or bourgeois, based on a notion of property that is a function of work taken as exchange and of social interactions that translate into exchange contracts, tends to become universal and to complete the humanization of the slave or bourgeois. The aristocratic notion of property is furthermore determined by the master's conception of justice, for which there is nothing as important as the preservation of equality. If we apply the aristocratic justice principle to the properties that the master owns, it follows that the master will seek to maintain them as unaltered as possible. Assuming this general premise, as well as the identity between his property and that of his comrades, the master may conceive of an eventual permutation of his properties, but their exchange will be out of the question. The term permutation presupposes equality and identity. That of exchange, by way of contrast, is inseparable from inequality and difference. The aristocratic mindset, excluding by definition the latter, the master's notion of property can be referred ultimately to a communal notion of property. If the master discards the exchange of essentially identical properties, he also conceives of them as the equal parts of a common shared whole, family, tribe, nation, depending on the case. This communal notion of property is confronted by Kojève with the communist one. Very much like the bourgeois, the communist worldview is alien to the aristocratic notion of property, and bourgeois and communist alike turn property into a function of work, according to which neither the peasant is the owner of the land he plows, nor the worker owner of the factory he works in. Instead, their income is based on the work they carry out, independently of the yield it delivers. By way of contrast, the aristocratic master, for whom his property is an equal part of a shared collective whole, is someone whose livelihood depends not on his work or action, but on his being an equal part, his property, of what he conceives of as a collective whole. The master's income appears in consequence linked to the yield that delivers the property he owns. Conclusion. Now, if on the one hand, commerce or exchange reveals the conceptual character of the product, and if on the other, work exchange entails the universalization of the slave or bourgeois so that the cell-like universality of the master can be replaced by a full one at the end of history, and if furthermore, work exchange is something that liberates the slave or bourgeois from his earthbound animal existence and opens up to him the realm of the seas and of the air, it is no less true that such a liberation can only take place under certain conditions. It can hardly develop, for instance, in a statal or political society in which the notion of property depends ultimately on aristocratic war and in which commerce or exchange can be curbed at will by the state. Fostering the existence of idle bondholders instead of stimulating the emergence of ever new needs, thanks to a circuit between human work and universal needs based on exchange, the state in its traditional political form ought to be replaced by the global economic society hitherto stifled by the former. Now, the shattered look of Sept circuit in 1945 did not seem very promising for such a liberation to happen. Did Kojève enter the French Ministry of Economic Affairs in 1945 and pursue his existential engagement with commercial policy issues even after his retirement in 1967 to reverse this situation and make the concept happen? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. And now we'll open up for discussion. Please feel free to make your questions however you feel like, in the chat, Q&A, or if you want to talk, you can raise your hand. And if you're, if you're one of the attendees, we can open the discussion. We can give you video and audio in case you want to talk. So feel free to do it whenever you want to. So perhaps I would start by asking Igor to make his question.
Well, thanks again to the presenters, the organizers. This is really a lot of fun and very stimulating. I suppose I have a question that may apply to both of the presenters and everyone in the room. Teresa, in particular, you mentioned the let's say the expulsion of heterogeneous features en route to the universal homogeneous state. And I don't want to get into the topic of my presentation, which will deal with some of this, Kojève's, relation to Marx and so forth, and the end of history. But I was struck by that when I read the outline, but also, of course, his introduction to the reading of Hegel, the extent to which the emphasis on homogeneity is so pervasive. Now, since you take Kojève to be sort of a pioneer that we can look towards, it is a kind of an alternative to the Kantian, the extremes of the Kantian, you could say universalism, which is very abstract and so on, and transcendent, right? And then the Schmittian one, which is the other extreme, which is predicated, as you said, on the friend-enemy distinction. Now, but if we think through this idea of the expulsion of heterogeneity, doesn't it create a lot of normative problems? In other words, what are the preconditions for the realization of a universal homogeneous state? Politically, it would mean perhaps some troubling things as well. So I'm just curious. I want to be open-minded about this. Why homogeneity at the end of the day? And I'm open, to any kind of perspective. I try to be as sympathetic as possible to Kojève. I can think it has a lot to do with Schmitt and his challenge, but maybe the solution is not necessarily adequate to that particular challenge. So that's my question.
Can we react to the questions or? Yes.
Yeah. Sorry, yeah, perhaps we should answer to each question at a time. Yeah, yeah.
So I can reply. Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much, Igor. I spent a lot of time on these questions. So the first, my interpretation is that the heterogeneous or the animal, what I say is that it is neutralized only at the end of history. And I think this is central. So I would link this question of the neutralization of the heterogeneous to the relation of time and the end of history and the question of wisdom. So my reading is that heterogeneity is not outside of the system and of the state. It is rather worked, taken in and worked. And I mentioned Bataille, maybe I did it too quickly, but I sort of make a model, which is, so for Bataille, the blind spot is this part of the eye that the eye doesn't see. So it is exactly what is the heterogeneity, what is outside of any universal system of knowledge. And what I mean when I say that Kojève is hypermodern is that he understands and takes in the political system as well as the system of knowledge, the heterogeneous or the blind spot. So this is the homogeneity of the system. There is no outside. There is a coincidence between concept, the time, and the subject. But this coincidence does not entail that the heterogeneous is not there, just that it is processed. And this is the work of law. And that's why I think it's the opposite of Kant, while Bataille would not be the opposite of Kant for me. And I think when you compare this, for example, to Europe, how Europe functions, European law, it is so interesting because I really see it in Europe, like differences are processed. So it's like you have a process in which homogeneity and heterogeneity are constantly working together. This is how I would translate it politically. So in no way I think Kojève means anything like a Stalin form of state or even a completely bureaucratic state. I don't think at all that this is. I think that we need to read this question of heterogeneity in relation to time. So even though when you read the outline, you have this Kojèvian writing, which I love, but which is also very, very abstract, or, you know, it seems like a landscape with no people. At the same time, I think it's super dynamic. And that's why I think also, I think that working with these concepts of the state, the law and the citizens, and Kojève's understanding of time and wisdom would be wonderful. So homogeneity, again, I think it's really linked to this idea of the link between the subjects, concept, and time. So, and also that's what fascinates me in Kojève is how his political insight is always going together with the philosophical question, and they run one together with the other. That's my reading. I understand though that it can, you know, that it can raise questions when you read the outline.
Thank you, Teresa. Luis, I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
Well, I would like to say that that perhaps, I mean, in this question of the homogeneity in Kojève, it seems to me that when we talk about homogeneity in Kojève is an homogeneity that contains all heterogeneity. No? So this homogeneity presupposes a previous existence of heterogeneity. No? So that is one thing. That is just a remark. You know? But at the same time, this homogeneity he describes at the end of his outline of a phenomenology of right, in which he says that more or less being coincides with will and action. That is, what one wants is what one is in a way the realization of ancient wisdom in a way, or what he describes as ancient wisdom. But the difficult thing for me to understand in Kojève, or to come to grips with in Kojève, is the fact that in order to attain that wisdom, I mean, why why this crusade against nature? I mean, why does he seems to hate nature? I mean, he even talks about the murder. No? The concept presupposes the murder of the thing, and I don't quite understand that kind of obsession, because the thing, the object, is what is here now, is what is different. So these are the kind of things that, in relation to homogeneity, I keep on asking myself whenever I read Kojève once and again.
Kyle has a question now, then I'll give the word to Andreas. So Kyle, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that my question is, it's a follow-up to what we're discussing right now. I hope it doesn't overlap too much, but just to pick up on what Luis was just saying, right, about this sort of problem that we have with Kojève dealing with nature, and what is this relationship to nature? I mean, I think that ultimately, I mean, this has a lot to do perhaps with what his relationship is with Schelling. But leaving that aside, I do have a question that's more general. In like, what is the status of the relationship? What is the status of the citizen, sorry, with respect to this so-called animal support? I think this is more of a question for Teresa, but I think I would also be interested in what Luis has to say. And the status of the citizen with respect to this animal support or nature, as it relates to Kojève's concept of history, or more specifically, his notion of post-historical animality, in his famous footnote that he added to the lectures. I mean, in other words, if, as it's suggested, the history of man is this liberation from his biological support or eradication of heterogeneities via the human desire for desire, then how does man stand in relation to its biology at the end of history? Does man really end up transcending nature in some way? And if so, how to understand this post-historical animality that he describes? I mean, I suppose what I'm trying to ask is, in another way, is that could we understand Kojève to be a thinker of utopia? And if so, is the citizen of the universal and homogeneous state a figure that has negated this tension between necessity and freedom? Or is there something of a deeper paradox going on here in Kojève, maybe a paradox inherent in the figure of something like the citizen, that Kojève's theory of the end of history or universality and homogeneity points towards?
Thank you, Kyle. So I start, and so first of all, just literally. So if we read the outline, the citizen becomes such at the end of history when he gets out. He becomes, rather than the actor, he becomes the spectator of the fight between the slave and the master, and he thus becomes the third, and this figure of the third is the figure of the law. And this is, for me, the engine in Kojève's outline of the end of history. So again, I would not say that Kojève negates nature. I would say that this action towards nature and this coming out of the spectator is exactly what brings us towards the system of wisdom and towards the end of history. So it's what Luis was saying before when he said that heterogeneity is within homogeneity. I think we need to think in Kojève heterogeneity and homogeneity together. And the question for me, it's not either homogeneity or heterogeneity, but I think his brilliant question is, which kind of institutional shapes do we have when through time we think the action of heterogeneity and homogeneity differently? And that's why for me, when we bring this from the philosophical to the political level, Kojève is one of the few people who is capable to understand. And the question at the end of the Second World War is not so much who will win or which kind of values will prevail, but the key question is the one of the shape, the form of the institutional system. And again, if I translate that politically, I think that this question of nature comes out when Kojève delineates in the Düsseldorf conference a vision that it's not so, in the end, his vision of the homogeneous state, it's paradoxically not so different from the one of Schmitt. That's why there he makes a plaidoyer for a European growth realm. So he has this vision of the universal and homogeneous state, but at the same time, he understands that we are moving towards a regional dimension. And again, this is not the work I've done, but I think that in questions of contemporary political philosophy, going deeper into Kojève's understanding of nature and time would be very interesting, as well as comparing it with figures such as Arendt or Jan Thomas again. So for me, it's not so much a question of negating nature, negating the heterogeneous, but it's rather how this double dynamic of homogeneity and heterogeneity with time changes the shape of the state. And then there is in the chat Terence, and he asks me about what I said, Kojève's homogeneity as opposed to Kant. Well, Kant for me is, especially in his understanding of it, for Kant, the cosmopolitan state, the cosmopolitan utopia is that we have nation states, and then they deal with each other economically, and this brings to a sort of cosmopolitan dimension of international relations and, of course, perpetual peace. And I think the great difference with Kojève is that for Kojève, time is never teleological. That's the meaning of the end of history. We will, and that's why I would say he is not a utopian thinker. Time is not something we have in the future. Time, on the opposite, acts at the beginning, and that's why we get then at the end of history. So whereas for Kant, we have an abstract universal, for Kojève, it's the reversal. I would say, again, here, I think that Kojève's understanding of universality, for me, it's closer to, for example, the one of Gilles Deleuze. So a universal which is never abstract and which is always understood through time or for the Deleuze movement.
Luis, I don't know if you want to say something. Alexis, I'll let you speak, but before I ask you, I'll ask Andreas to make his question because he's waiting for a while. But Luis, I don't know if you also want to answer to Kyle. Oh, Andreas seemed to have left, so okay. So Luis, sorry, do you want to answer to Kyle or?
Hello, can you hear me? Sorry, there was some Zoom was doing something. Wait, I turn on the camera. Hi, yeah, thank you very much for the great talks. I have a question specifically for Teresa Pullano regarding the Düsseldorf lecture, because something it's more for myself to understand it because I'm still working through it. I was interested in the figure of Henry Ford that Kojève mentions, and how it then relates to his own suggestions of this gift colonialism. Yeah, because for me there seems to be the suggestion that kind of one implies the other, that kind of Henry Ford's way of kind of in as I understand Kojève's terms, kind of modernizes or updates capitalism in a way that alleviates some of the kind of like striking class differences that Marx was still writing about, and that he does this in a way as a kind of historical agent of the capitalist class as a whole, like so kind of as I understand the thesis is that the capitalist class itself resolves in some way these contradictions, but then how does this, because then of course Kojève also says there's this other contradiction of the global, this kind of global divide, this colonial divide, and then again, yeah, is there sort of, or could you say, or I'm wondering if this is something that in a way Kojève universalizes as kind of a movement, and is this same kind of historical movement suggested for the colonial situation? That I mean, I think he does, but I'm just kind of wondering, because for me the circumstances seem so different, and I think maybe one small additional thing also, in which way also the interests of the capitalist class align with interests of nation states in this sense, because yeah, Henry Ford is a private capitalist who updated certain things in economics, but Kojève is arguing more from the perspective of the EU and regulations, and there seems just to be a certain difference, but at the same time he links these two things together.
Thank you, Andreas. So this whole part of the Düsseldorf conference is quite complex, because I think we can read it. So Kojève makes one first shift. He says that capitalism in 1957 is not alive in the West anymore. But he says that basically the Soviet Union represents capitalism as understood, that capitalism survives there. This is the first move he makes. And so to some extent, it is as if Ford, and so the kind of the labor relations that are behind capitalism, they moved from the US to the Soviet Union. So he makes this first inversion. And then he says, I think, that Europe should make the same inversion. So Europe, as the heart of colonialism, should rather invert the relationship with the colonized countries and become colonized. That's what he calls the gift colonialism. Of course, this is provocatory on the one hand, said at the time. On the other hand, I think that this is also very much visionary on two levels. First of all, if we look today at post-colonial relations between Europe and Africa, for example, can we say, of course, this Ford gesture was never done by Europe, but can't we say that there has been a reversal of colonial relations? Can't we say that some features that Europe exported to Africa are coming back? This is, for example, what Achille Mbembe would say. So I would say that Kojève was foreseeing many of the themes that occupy today's post-colonial theory, on the one hand. On the other hand, politically, this instead corresponds to a reality of the time. There is a book by Theo Hansen called Eurafrica, and he reconstructs how, after the decolonization, many European states saw the European Union as one way of prolongating colonial relations. And I think Kojève was probably, I'm not an intellectual historian, so an intellectual historian would be better in this sense, but maybe Kojève was also trying to shift what he was seeing, that in the end, colonialism has always been an international endeavor from the start, not a national endeavor, a global endeavor. And probably he was trying to shift this connection happening at the time between decolonization and the building of the European Union towards a Franco-Mediterranean understanding. That's my take. Thank you.
Thank you.
Luis, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, perhaps a couple of things. First, I would like to say that I agree with Teresa when he says that Kojève, according to her, is not an utopian thinker. I think it's one of the things that is more or less clear to me regarding Kojève. I think he actually hates utopia. I mean, you know, he he endorses utopia to intellectuals, no? Incapable of acting. And in this sense, in the sense of this claim for action, this claim for action can be related to the personality of Henry Ford. I mean, Henry Ford is a man of action, and usually Kojève admires men of action. That is a point I wanted to make. Another thing, and in this sense, I don't agree with Teresa. I don't think he can be taken as a model for a political endeavor. I think at least by me, Kojève raises more preventions than anything else, because this homogeneity that contains all heterogeneity, this being that coincides with what one wants and what one does, this coincidence, and that presupposes, by the way, the depletion, this idea of this Kojèvian idea of depletion. No? The history at its end depletes conflict, depends current affairs, depletes also the Schmittian taking. You know? There is no longer taking, there's nothing but giving. That is a condition of the circularity of his idea of circularity, because circularity presupposes this kind of encompassing everything that previously happened in terms of conflict, in terms of current affairs, in terms of taking. But if you join this idea of circularity to his idea of authority, when one gets the impression that he's speaking or talking about a kind of, Buddha that doesn't need to do anything in order to make others do what he wants them to do. Well, I arrived to his idea of the final state, a perfect machine. And actually, in his correspondence with Strauss, Kojève talks about automata, sick automata, that are not happy in his final state. So that is what makes me somewhat skeptical about his political ideas.
Thank you. Alexis, perhaps I pass it now to you.
All right, thank you. So maybe thanks for the talks and for the question of homogeneity. I think it's fascinating, and I would like to say something about it, because I think what is very important regarding homogeneity is that it's social homogeneity. It's not like it's not biological homogeneity. Alexander the Great, he tried biological homogeneity and that failed. It's social homogeneity, and that means that is related to labor, not every type of labor, but social labor. And what social labor is specifically human labor. And what makes labor social labor is exchange, as Luis said. So social homogeneity is linked to exchange, and it's not exchange of commodity, of products. It's not exchange of working force. It's exchange of working force engaged in a common cause. And as you said, Luis, working force engaged in a common cause, this is the base of salary. Salary is the virtual exchange of our collective work. So social homogeneity is linked almost directly to the question of universal salary. And universal salary is much debated now, is hotly debated now, and it implies, I think, a struggle regarding what is our common project, what could be socially recognized as work or labor. I mean, through our particular or heterogeneous actions, raising a child, cooking, going to the school, we could be either recognized as social working force or private working force. And I think social homogeneity is directly linked to this political question. So this is what I wanted to say, because I think it could be inferred quite directly from the outline, Kojève's outline. But maybe this is something we should discuss more. Thank you.
Well, according to me, Alexis, it's very interesting what you say, in the sense that in effect, social homogeneity perhaps is perhaps Kojève's goal, no? But that leads me to the question, the social question in Kojève, because I have the impression, or I have the impression, whenever I read something of him, that the social as such, is linked to this desire of recognition. That is, the constitutive element of the social realm is the desire of recognition. That is the others, the gaze of the others. And these others, and not only one or two or three, but humanity as a whole. Humanity as a whole observes you, you know, and that is the way. That is once again why whenever I approach to the social factor in Kojève, I have again my preventions. You know, it strikes me. It happens also in the outline of phenomenology of right. He refers this recognition to the whole. You know, I mean, the mass of humanity, the whole, the power of the whole. And that is something that you know, is just following your question on the social issue, you know, and the question of the social homogeneity. That is sometimes I have the feeling that the whole of humanity is there to observe us. We can even link this following a reading of the outline of phenomenology of right also to the potentiality that Kojève attaches to the virtual, to the what happens virtually. No? I mean, for example, his idea of law, of modern law, actually, because it seems that Kojève has a positive reading of the emergence of the modern individual in the Renaissance. So, but in any case, it's just the time when, according to him, law begins to, you know, to become not to concentrate on the act, but on the will and on the intention. And I'm not sure, but at the end of the phenomenology of right, I'm not sure whether he's describing also a kind of judge state that reaches that will and intention. Just wanted to you know, to share these thoughts relating to your question on homogeneity and social homogeneity, because sorry once again, in his exchange with Strauss, he talks also about social control. Social control is the guarantee of truth.
Thank you for. Alexis, you seem that you might want to reply to that, or sorry, Isa, I'll get back to you after.
I could, but I don't want to monopolize.
Okay, so Isa.
I have a very brief question, but I think it's quite abstract, so I see what we do with it. But it's going back to what you said about the concept, which is such a central concept in Kojève, and I think I was thinking a lot about it. And you frame it in quite economic terms, emerging somewhat from exchange, but also permutation and the production process itself. And then on the other hand, you said the concept is somehow thought as the murder of things, or that there's a certain tension between the thing and the concept. At the same time, you align the product or the thing and the concept. And I was just interested in how you would conceptualize this Kojèvian notion of the concept, which is also time itself, and why you think this economic reading could maybe give a clue how we can read Kojève's concept of concept. I hope that's not too complicated, but I'm just interested in your ideas on that.
Luis, you're muted.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Isabel, for your question. In my presentation, let's say that I tried to make clear a Kojèvian distinction between the thing. The thing can be seen by Kojève as a thing lying in the world, a thing that occupies on space and that evolves in a certain time. That is, on the other hand, the thing can be conceived as something naturally given, all right? But the product that Kojève makes this distinction between the thing as a finished product and the thing and the product as a finished thing, if you like, and the product as a concept project. And he makes once the product is produced, that product that plays in the world is equivalent to a thing, to a given thing that, in order to become human again, needs a further transformation. That's why universal needs, according to him, vary indefinitely, or are liable to vary indefinitely, to change indefinitely. So the slave or bourgeois needs to keep on transforming things, guided by this universal drive that supposedly will lead to his liberation. That is the thing. I mean, once again, the thing and the product as a finished product belong to the present time, whereas the thing conceptualized as a concept project, as a project even, is liable to follow this Kojèvian temporal pattern. That is, future in the first place, future pulling from time, and present following future, but passing through memory. That is past. Is the concept project what allows time to pass, whereas the thing is just present. I don't know if I have been able to answer your question. Hope so.
Yeah, very fascinating. Your answer, also how it relates back to how temporality is conceived. Thank you.
Perhaps I'll make a question now, and if we are approaching also the end, so after we might have a break for a coffee, or if someone else wants to make one question after me, that's also fine. But my question is that all of us seem to be, well, both of you seem to be discussing something that is quite interesting, that is Kojève as possibly opening this post-Schmittian horizon. And both of you discussed it through different perspectives, one more economic, the other more legal, more juridical, well, based on rights. And my question is not only what is this alternative, but also how do you interchange with one another? Because both of you are using almost the same texts. Teresa is going to the 57 Dusseldorf lecture that is also quite economic. So how, and Luis engages with the outline of knowledge of right. And how do you see the interchange between these two topics and also the priority of one of them over the other? And how does this constitute this possible post-Schmittian horizon? So this is probably for both of you. So yeah, perhaps Luis first, and yeah.
Luis, you're muted again.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I think although Teresa and me approach the same things, the same subjects, the same topics in Kojève, and perhaps reading the same books and analyzing the same paragraphs, we might not agree in certain things, because again, I mean, if I come back to law, how Kojève describes law in his outline of a phenomenology of right, I don't see, I hardly see how it is, how can it be applicable to you know, to our modern world, you know, in a democratic way at least. On the other hand, when Teresa mentions also his writings on the Given in Düsseldorf, and his conference of Düsseldorf, and his essay about the Latin Empire. Well, again, I mean, the Latin Empire is, for me at least, a clear example of you know, of what I mean. It's hard for me to define it, but what is he talking about? Kojève is talking about creating an empire that, you know, almost out of the blue, that comprises that is led by France, that comprises Spain and Italy, but I mean, how it's difficult to me to see there any potentiality whatsoever with respect to our time, and in relation to his talk in Düsseldorf. Yes, I think indeed that he uses that conference to champion an idea that he cherishes, and according to me, at least, what he cherishes is the achievement of his final state. You know, this universal state where everyone, you know, more or less, he says so to Schmitt in one of his letters, more or less wants the same as the other, acts equally as the other. So he even has a very interesting reference, according to me, to the entertainment to the entertainment industry, to the fact of not being bored. I think that is very interesting, because I think there's a kind of he kind of, you know, I was reminded of some the passages in in the French philosopher on entertainment called Pascal. You know? I mean, there's a reference there to Pascal, and it's very interesting because he makes two references, at least in what I've read of Kojève, to Pascal, and there's a lot there to I mean, one can draw upon this analogy, perhaps, but once again, it's hard for me to see the applicability of his ideas, although I admit that he carried them out. So I think he was not an utopian guy, and I think he carried out much of his ideas. And I think that, I mean, the world we live now is very much indebted to what he did and to what he thought. And that troubles me.
So thank you, Jorge. For me, the confrontation between Kojève and Schmitt is essential. So Düsseldorf is invited by Schmitt, Kojève-Schmitt correspondence. If we go back to this question of homogeneity, I agree with Alexis that there is a social basis to this theme of homogeneity, but Kojève is also very clear in the outline. Homogeneity means also spatial homogeneity. So it means, he says this very clearly, that the universal and homogeneous state will have no outside. There will be no other state bordering with this universal state. And this is exactly the opposite. And this is, in this, Kojève is negating Schmitt. He says this clearly. He says for him, in the universal state, there will be no enemy. So this no outside translates, no outside of the law, no outside of the state, translates for me exactly in the opposition with Schmitt. There will be no line either as a territorial line, nor as a political line between the friend and the enemy. But I read this as basically a step forward. I would put Kant, Schmitt, and Kojève is like the hypermodern substantion of all the problems that we have in Kant and in Schmitt. But the homogeneity in Kojève does not forget the enemy, does not forget the line, and therefore for me does not forget what is the political that is contained in the Schmittian version. It is worked through time.
Thank you. Perhaps the last question by Danilo.
Yeah, thank you for these very interesting talks. I've got a question for Teresa. I didn't quite understand how you meant to connect the quest or the attainment for wisdom to a concept of citizenship, because I mean, if that's where we are kind of trying to update Kojève for our times, I think that would be the last place I would start, because clearly wisdom is not the preserve of the many, but the few, even in the post-historical state. So I think if you make that the basis for citizenship, I mean, you kind of end up almost with a sort of cognitive two-class society. And I mean, that's always something that seems very clear to me, that there's a form of elitism that will persist at the end of history, and that is not attainable for the broad mass of the population.
Thank you very much, Danilo. First, I connect wisdom and the question of citizenship always through the question of time. The citizen will be there at the end of history. And for me, this is also very important. It is the post-revolutionary citizen. That's why we have the citizen, not the citizen. It's not like for Kant, it's not given per se, but it's the result of the process of the end of history. And I said that at the beginning. For me, the question of the citizen in Kojève is the answer to the question, how do we, after the Second World War, think history and emancipation without positing a collective subject, which incarnates in the form of the nation. So that's for me the meaning of the link between the citizen, wisdom, and the end of history. It's through this question of the post-revolutionary citizen. Then your other question, the aristocratic aspect in Kojève. This is definitely there, that's for sure. But at the same time, I think that when we look at Europe, for example, at the European Union, for me, we are definitely in a post-revolutionary situation, meaning that no one thinks that Europe will be rebuilt as a new nation, right? That's the fracture he finds himself in after the Second World War. So I think that that's the effort we can do today. How do we think emancipatory politics without positing a new temporal horizon, and with it, a new subject, a new singular collective subject of history, and that's the figure of the citizen. Yeah, so in that sense, although there are, of course, aristocratic aspects in Kojève, I don't think that this is his question. And even I think that his way of thinking the post-revolutionary subject is a way out of a mass society.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'm sure we could keep on discussing all of these topics for a while. And we'll have the opportunity to do that during the next few panels, and some of the following presentations will also touch in some of the issues that were raised here. Now we should probably have a 15-minute break before we come back with Boris Groy's presentation. And so perhaps for a coffee, or depending on your time zone, whatever you prefer to do. So see you in a little bit.